welcome back to History of Christianity. Last time we finished our second section in this course, which was medieval Christianity. And today we're going to now transition into our third section of this course, which begins with the Reformation. And in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the spark of the Reformation and the man that did it, Martin Luther, and the nailing of the 95 Theses and what the issue was that caused him to want to try to reform the Catholic Church. And then we will also look at his life and his theology. So stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're going to have our PowerPoint lecture here on Martin Luther. Before we get into Martin Luther, there's two things we need to talk about. We need to talk about the call for the Reformation, and then we're going to talk about a man named Erasmus, who is also important to the Reformation. And then we'll get into our slides on Martin Luther. First, the call for the Reformation. There had been calls for reforming activity before the actual Reformation under Martin Luther. If you remember, Wycliffe and Huss and Savonarola and their followers, and there were some others that called for Reformation. But we have some main reasons here. Number one, the decline and corruption of the papacy, which we saw many examples of that in the past lectures. Number two, the failure of the conciliar movement or the councils to bring reform. We looked at that in a previous lecture also. The conciliar movement was basically who these councils were being called, and the main issue was who had the power to call a council, and it never solved anything. Number three, absenteeism. That's where the bishop was absent from his parish or the parishes that he was in control of. He was off living in luxury while the people lived in poverty in his parishes. Number four, simony, where you buy or sell a church office. Number five, nepotism, where you appoint family members into church office. Number six, open immorality because of broken celibacy. So the priests were having relationships with women and having children with them, and it was just an open. It wasn't even a secret anymore, even trying to hide it. They were just doing it in the open. Number seven, religious conscience of Europe was divided. People saw that they belonged to the church, which they said the church was like the spiritual mother, but then they looked at their spiritual mother and it was utterly corrupt. And so in their mind it was divided. How can you have a spiritual mother, but yet the entire thing is corrupt? Number eight, revival and remembrance of Wycliffe's and Huss's ideals. Number nine, economic discontent of the masses. So, if you remember a while back, you had the monks and the churches and people in the church and certain priests within the church. They were trying to help the poor, help the masses. But now, number nine, it says their economic discontent of the masses. The poor were no longer even feeling that the church was even out to help them anymore. That it seemed like the church was just doing its own thing, and the people were still in poverty and just not getting the help. Number 10, the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century had gotten out of control. We didn't talk about the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition was used for a couple centuries before this as a way to root out heresy. But then the Catholic Church gave the country of Spain basically authority to hold its own Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition was basically the Inquisition on steroids. They took this tool to fight heresy, and they used it. It basically degraded to political and personal gain, and a lot of times even to vengeance. And a lot of this happened within the Spanish territory. So the Inquisition was used by the Catholic Church to get rid of heresy, but the Spanish Inquisition just took it to the next level. And again, how can the church be doing this? The church was like killing people. And so people saw a need for reform. And then number 11 is humanism, which we talked about previously. But we're going to talk about this guy here, number 11 there. It says Desiderius Erasmus, and we're just going to call him Erasmus. Okay, so there he is. His date's 1466 to 1536. So he lived before the Reformation started, and then the Reformation started in 1517, and then continued on. And so he lived a good number of years after the Reformation started. He was born in Holland. He was poor, and he was the illegitimate child of a priest and a doctor's daughter. And that's a very famous painting of him. If you look up anything with Erasmus, that's the picture you're going to get. Okay, so Erasmus' ideas of humanism, he rejected scholasticism. He loved literature and he started reading the Bible. He mastered the Greek language. By using this humanistic spirit, he said the Christian can live decent, moderately balanced lives, but this would not be done in a monastery. So previously, if you were going to live this ascetic life, a moderate, balanced life, you basically would have to live like a monk. Well, he said you don't need to live like a monk in a monastery. Instead, you just have to be a good soldier of Christ, which is to live the practical daily life of the Christian in human affairs. He was convinced that the problems in Christianity, which is the church, was inward. And again, that's that humanistic idea. If we can clean up what's within, then we'll be okay. So, in regards to the problems, he said the sacraments were important, but the inner meaning of the sacrament was more important. He wanted to clean up these inner problems. And he said this phrase here, what good is it to be outwardly sprinkled with holy water if one is filthy within? So again, it's a humanistic idea of this inward look at man. Man is the center. And if we can clean up these ideas within the church from within, then the church from without will look good and will be good. He said the popes were as bad as pagans, and he rejected all the pomp and all the rituals that the papacy did. He supported the Reformation movement, but he hated dissension. And obviously, during the Reformation movement, there's a lot of dissension, and he really didn't like it. He wrote Praise of Folly in 1509, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And that epitomized the moral essence of humanism in its insistence on heartfelt goodness as opposed to formalistic piety. And basically, what that means is if you clean up what is inside, the heartfelt goodness, if you can be a good Christian, then you don't even need to do all that formalistic, ritualistic piety that the church said you had to do to be a good Christian. The intellectual stimulation provided by humanists helped spark the Reformation, from which, however, many humanists, included Erasmus, recoiled. So again, it's that he supported the Reformation, but he did not like the dissension that took place when the Reformation movement really started going. He was a king among scholars in the early part of the 16th century, and he was known as the Prince of Christian Humanists. He delved into some translation work. He sought to revive the spirit of the classical and Christian antiquities and make them a reforming power for the church. And so under the guidance of Johann Froben, he enlisted Erasmus to translate the New Testament. Now this New Testament, it was translated, and it was just really done quickly, rushed to complete this translation work in 6 months. But the problem is, if you rush something like that, it's going to contain errors, and it contained over 400 errors, and it had to be revised in 1522. The second translation was used by Martin Luther to write his German translation, and then Erasmus revised it a third time several years later, and this version became the basis for the Textus Receptus. And it probably, because it was produced first, it cost less and was small, it became the standard text for several hundred years. Textus Receptus is the root for the King James Version of the Bible. Two major works by Erasmus. Okay, here we see number one there, the Praise of Folly, which I had mentioned, written in 1509 and printed in 1511. It was a satire of the Roman Catholic Church. It talked about superstitions, which that's spelled wrong, apologize, rituals, abuses, etc. It was written to amuse his friend, Sir Thomas More, who was Lord Chancellor for Henry VIII. Folly is the name of the main character in the book, so it's the Praise of Folly. Well, that's a character. And she stands in front of a crowd while wearing a fool's costume, and she praises herself basically on virtues and merits. And so it's basically saying the Catholic Church is like this fool who is praising itself for virtue and merit, but no one believes in their virtue and merit anymore. Number 2, Julius Exclusus from heaven, 1514. This is a story about Pope Julius meeting Peter at the gates of heaven. And the Pope demands entrance based on his works and his reputation and even threatening Peter. And basically what happens is a comical debate ensues as the Pope explains his corrupt achievements on earth. Now, when the Pope is talking, Peter is horrified at the Pope and of the state of the papacy and is more adamant and refuses the Pope's entrance into heaven. And this work, Julius Exclusus from heaven, is a strong criticism of the Pope, of the papacy, of the Catholic Church, of simony, which is the sale of office, of nepotism, which is the family appointments, and then just the Church's totalitarian rule. So a really heavy-hitting work against the papacy. Okay, so now we're going to move into Martin Luther. And obviously Martin Luther, well known for sparking the Reformation. Here's probably the most well-known painting of Martin Luther, entitled Martin Luther, by Lucas Cranach the Elder. 1529 is when that was painted. It's probably the most famous painting of Martin Luther. We're going to run down through early years. We're going to run down through some timeline and achievements that happened and how the Reformation started, and then we're going to look at some of his theology. So first, early years in education. Born to a German peasant family on November 10th, 1483. His dad worked in the copper mines, and he had a very rough childhood. His dad used corporal punishment, and even in school, he got an answer wrong and was taken out and whipped. So just a very difficult childhood. 1501, Luther was sent to the University of Erfurt to study law. 1505, conversion. And became an Augustinian monk. And I'll talk about his conversion here just in a minute because it's kind of like it's a conversion, but it's kind of like a story that's going to lead to kind of drawn out, and finally at the end he's converted. 1507, he earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. 1508, he began teaching theology at the University of Wittenberg. Always remember that the W in German sounds like a V, so it's Wittenberg. He was adept at public debates and was given the nickname the philosopher. And then in 1512, he earned his doctorate of theology. Okay, so his conversion. While returning home from Erfurt one time, he was riding his horse and he went in a thunderstorm came up and a lightning bolt struck nearby and it really scared him. And so what Luther did, I'm not sure why, but what Luther did was he cried out and he said, "Saint Anne, save me. I will become a monk." And this is his first step in his path to find peace with God, to where he finally does get saved. But he says, "Saint Anne, save me. I'll become a monk." And there's a picture there on the right of the thunderstorm, and you see the lightning bolt behind Saint Anne. She's up there floating kind of above the rocks. And you see Luther on his knees begging for her to save him. So he enters an Augustinian monastery against his father's wishes. His father wanted him to become a lawyer, but he goes against his father's wishes. He is a good monk, and he's consumed with his guilt before God. When he's in the monastery, he does what he's supposed to do, but he just has this a sense of his guilt. It terrorized him that he could not be good enough for God no matter how hard he tried. And so he did his first Mass as a monk in 1507, and he said that the fear of God was on him so much that it almost prostrated him, which basically means he almost fell down face first on the floor while doing this Mass. Which he did not. He completed the Mass, but it was just this fear of God over him. He was obedient to the Catholic Church in every way, so he's a really good Catholic monk, and he engaged in almost obsessive confessions. Okay, 1510, he went to Rome and was horrified by what he saw. Okay, so we're still in the story of his conversion. He saw the blatant sin among the clergy. He saw the insincerity of the priests. he saw all these things in the center, the center of the church, which is Rome, and he just couldn't believe it. However, he did the deeds of a good Catholic monk on pilgrimage. So he went and saw the sites, he went and saw the relics, and did all the rituals that a monk should do on pilgrimage. But he found no comfort in any of these things that he did. In 1512, while a teacher at Wittenberg, he has this deep awareness of sin, and he would confess his sin for up to 6 hours at a time. And now when I say confess his sin, you have to remember that in the Catholic Church, especially with a monk, but in the Catholic Church, you have the person doing the confessing, and they will go to a confessor and confess their sins. And so Martin Luther had a confessor, and he would go to him and just confess his sins, and then leave. And on the way out of where they do the confession, he would run back in and say he forgot something, and he would confess more sin. And it got so tiring for the confessor that the confessor told Martin Luther to write down his sins and bring them in next time, so he didn't have to run out and remember and come back. But he was just consumed with his sin and his confession. He was once asked if he loved God, and Luther replied, weeping, "Love him, I hate him," because he just had so much guilt on him for of how much of a sinner he was. In 1515, while teaching on Romans 1, Luther realized the word righteousness from Romans 1:17 means not only the condition of being righteous, but also the act of being declared righteous. So the church was all about being righteous, doing things to be righteous. But while reading this, he realized that God made him righteous, and God is not only the one that's righteous, but he gives the righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. And so he realized this, and Luther quit trying to reconcile deserving salvation for his work through his works, and he accepted the gift of God, the gift of salvation from God. And so he was finally converted. Okay, so that's his conversion. Now we're going to talk about what sparked the Reformation. And it begins with this guy. He was a priest. His name was John Tetzel. And he was selling indulgences. So here's what we have. In 1517, Luther was teaching and also pastoring a village church near Mainz. Pope Leo X needed money to finish the refurbishment and construction of St. Peter's Basilica, which is in Rome. So he made a deal. Pope Leo X makes a deal with the German Prince Albert. And this is the deal. The German prince could sell indulgences in Mainz if half the money went to the Pope and the other half went to Prince Albert. So that's a win-win for both of them. Now, what is an indulgence? In the middle of your screen there, it says an indulgence is paying money to the Catholic Church to reduce the penalty for sin or the time spent in purgatory. So you pay money, you get a little slip of paper, and it takes time off of purgatory for you. Well, John Tetzel, he was like the famous peddler of indulgences, especially in Germany, because that's where he went and was selling indulgences. And he was like the lead peddler of indulgences. Now, his famous phrase, and if you do any kind of study of Martin Luther and the Reformation, especially the beginning of it, you'll hear this phrase. His famous phrase from John Tetzel: "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." So when they put the coins in the chest, and as soon as you hear them tinkle into the chest, then a soul from purgatory is being released. Now, this misuse of power, it just enraged Luther. Here's a picture of John Tetzel, and I put some arrows there. Notice the indulgence receipts. So up here, it says bull and indulgent. So like a bull is a decree. So it's basically receipts. And if you can see there's actually numbers on here. So if you paid 100 or you paid 50 or 20, if you paid that, that's what you would get. So you get this little receipt that you paid for an indulgence, and you will get time off in purgatory for that amount of money. And then you see here, there's the money box, so that you put the coin in the top. You see the lock for the key. coin at the top, and he's got his hand right on that money box. So that's John Tietzel. Here's another one. This is a 1521 woodcut, selling of indulgences. And so you have Tietzel here up on the little podium or pulpit area, and then here's the indulgences here on the paper. And then down here's the money box. You see the big chest here, and the guy's putting a coin in right there. Another thing that's kind of funny is that they've made the church, so here's the cross and the crown of thorns and all of that, into a marketplace. You see the guy selling things here at the table, and there's coins and different things. So it's just a corruption of the church. So this enrages Luther, and so what Luther does, he writes his 95 Theses. Luther decided to issue a protest after Tietzel had come through as selling the indulgences. So on October 31st, 1517, he posted his famous 95 Theses, which is basically complaints about the Catholic Church and definitely about the abuses of indulgences. Now, when he nailed this to the door, at the church door in the castle of Wittenberg, he really just wanted to have a debate, and really it would have had little impact. But what happened was some students took it down, translated it, and it was then spread all around. So it's in German, and it went all around. So at first, it's not taken seriously. Pope Leo's response to 95 Theses was that Luther is a drunk German. He'll recant when he is sober. So the 95 Theses got printed and spread around, so it moved around. Now, when you nailing of the 95 Theses to the church door, that also was not uncommon. That's where it was almost like a community bulletin board. It was, they would put things on the doors of churches so that people knew what was going on. And so here's just a picture, painting by Huebner, which is the late painting, 19th century, just called Theses. And you see Luther here in the center, and it's being nailed up there to the door. And over here is the fat Tietzel over here with his hand being kissed because he just sold some indulgence or something. So just a painting about the 95 Theses being nailed to the door. Okay, so a summary of the 95 Theses. Number one, no divine authority given to man to allow a soul to be released from purgatory when money is given. So Luther said it's ridiculous to think that you can give money and then the soul will be released. Number two, all those that believe they are saved through letters of indulgence from the Catholic Church are actually damned along with their teachers. So again, if you buy enough indulgences, then you're basically saved. You could have whatever it is, 1,000 years off of your time in purgatory. So you bought enough that you wouldn't even be in purgatory very long, so you'll be saved. And he said that's again, he condemned that, and also the teachers that taught that. Number three, question the need for the Pope, who is one of the wealthiest men, to collect and charge the people for refurbishment of St. Peter's Basilica. Okay, so the Pope has all kinds of money. Why is he selling these things if he has money to refurbish this basilica? Number four, questions why the indulgences were sold for forgiveness when the Pope had, and it says in quotes there, had the authority to forgive sins, which is Catholic dogma, 100 times a day. So remember, if someone wants to confess their sin, they go to the priest, and the priest will give them forgiveness. They might have to do some things, say some prayers, or do something for the forgiveness of their sins, but the priest would be able to do that. Well, the authority for the priest and the bishop and the archbishop, and where does that authority come from to forgive sins? It comes from the Pope. And so Martin Luther is saying the Pope is the one on top. He's the one that can forgive sins 100 times a day. So why would he need to sell indulgences to basically forgive sin to get time off of purgatory? Okay, so he writes the 95 Theses, posts it, and it's spread around. And so this really starts the ball rolling on the actual Reformation. 1518, Pope Leo X orders Luther to appear at Rome. Well, Frederick the Wise, who was a German prince. Now, remember, Germany was not a nation or a country right yet. It was a lot of broken up city, almost like city states or territories, and they were Germanic, but they were controlled by their own kings and princes and all of that. Well, Frederick the Wise was a German prince. He refuses to make Luther go. Now, Luther is in his territory, and Frederick said, "You don't have to go." And Luther knows better not to go because chances are he would have been arrested and then basically martyred. So Luther knows not to go. In 1519, in Leipzig, there's a debate with John Eck. And Luther said that the Council of Constance had wrongfully declared John Huss a heretic, and that a Christian with scriptural support has more authority than a council or the Pope. So now Luther's stepping in that and really defending Huss, who was viewed as a heretic by the Catholic Church, and said, no, Huss was not a heretic. He had the Bible's support, and that alone has more authority than a council or a pope. So Martin Luther's not getting on the favorable side for the Catholic Church. In 1520, there's a papal bull, Exsurge Domine, which means arise, Lord. This papal bull was given, and it gave gave Luther 60 days to submit to the Pope or be excommunicated. And now this is where Pope Leo, he kind of gives a famous phrase, and he calls Luther a wild boar in the Lord's vineyard. And he's equating the Lord's vineyard as the church. And he's saying that Luther is a wild boar just tearing up the church. Well, Luther took this bull, the Exsurge Domine, he took that and he burned it. Okay, so just continuing on the timeline after the 95 Thesis, and we'll continue picking up with the story just in a moment. But in the time period going on in 1520, Luther, he decides to write also, and he writes 3 books, and these 3 books are attacks on the Roman Church. And they're on the screen there for you. You do need to know them. The Address to the Christian Nobility. He called on the secular authorities, so that's like the princes and the kings, to legislate reform that the church refused to do. He addressed the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, and he destroyed the idea of any special class of priest. So this first book basically said there's no priests in the Catholic Church. It basically, if you're a Christian, a true Christian, you hold the priesthood. You are the priesthood of all believers. So he holds to that biblical doctrine and slams the Catholic Church on it. Number 2, he writes Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And this described Luther's disgust that the priest had a hold on the sacraments and that Christians had to perform good works to gain salvation. So here, Luther rejects the sacraments, and there were 7 of them. He rejects the sacraments except the Lord's Supper and baptism. He kept those 2 sacraments. He rejected the tradition that priest blessing changed the elements in the Eucharist, so he rejected transubstantiation. Number 3, on the freedom of the Christian. And this was a discussion of the Christian's conduct and life. He said, quote, "A Christian is perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is perfectly dutiful servant of all and subject to all." So just a look there for the freedom of the Christian and the conduct of their life. Okay, continuing on the timeline, we get to 1521, and we have this meeting called the Diet of Worms. And Martin Luther expected to die there. And we just remember Huss. Well, Martin Luther expected he's going to go to the Diet, and he'll probably end up being arrested and then martyred, and he's going to be killed. Diet is an imperial word for meeting. It's just a different way of saying meeting. It's called a diet. He was called before the ecclesiastical court to give a defense of his works. And he was asked to recant. That's really all they wanted. They wanted him to recant what he said. On April 15th, 1521, a bishop pointed to a heap of books on the floor. These books were written by Luther. And the bishop said, "Did you write these?" Luther says, "They are all mine." "Do you defend them?"
And Luther, he says, he doesn't say yes or no, or anything. He says, give me time to think it over, which is kind of curious, but he says that, give me time to think it over. The next day, they haul him in front of the court, and on April 16th, and the same questions were given, and the same question, but a different answer was given. And so when he said, do you defend them? The famous response from Luther, there in quotes, and this is probably one of the most famous quotes of Luther, he says, my conscience is captive to the word of God. I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither honest nor safe. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. So he's thinking that he just put the nail in his own coffin. Okay, here's a painting by Werner in 1877. Luther at the Diet of Worms. Okay, so in 1521, the Edict of Worms is issued by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, which made Luther an outlaw. Now, what happened was, after the Diet, he was actually taken out, and Frederick the Wise got a hold of him and protected him, and actually kept him, held him friendly hostage in his castle so he'd be safe. And it's during that time that Martin Luther translates the Bible into German. 1524, Erasmus, who we talked about earlier, he issues a challenge to Luther in his On the Freedom of the Will. That's not overly important, but it's just that same time period. Erasmus, the humanistic thinking, is involved in the Reformation. June 1525, Luther marries Catherine von Bora. Now, she was an escaped nun. She escaped with 11 other nuns, and they escaped the convent in herring barrels. You know, herring is a fish, and they would salt the fish and pack it in barrels. Well, these are they put the nuns in the barrel instead of the fish, and they were able to get out of the convent. She was a feisty, red-headed 26-year-old, and Martin Luther was 42. And so there's a picture of her over there, Catherine von Bora, by Lucas Cranach the Elder, 1526. So she's a redhead, a handsome woman. Martin decided to marry Catherine for 3 reasons. Number one, it would please his father. So remember, he was a monk who was sworn to celibacy, but then once the Reformation started, he scrapped that. He got rid of, he didn't follow that sacrament anymore, and so he married Catherine. Well, that made his father happy. He married her to provoke the Pope, and then also to pass on his name, the family name. While preparing for his marriage, Martin wrote, quote, I would not exchange Katie, that's what he called her. He called her my Katie. I would not exchange Katie for France, because God gave her to me, and other women have worse faults. So I'm not sure if that's the best compliment for his wife, but he did love his wife, and they had a very good marriage. Nicknamed his favorite book, which was Galatians, he nicknamed that book of the Bible My Katie. For some reason, that's what he did. He had 6 biological children with his wife, and then they adopted 4 other children, and they were happily married until his death. And here's just a painting of the family. You have Martin Luther here in the center on this guitar thing, and the children are singing hymns, I guess, and here's Katie sitting there, and then there's this guy back there in the back. 1525 to 26, Luther is involved in the Peasants' Revolt in Germany. And this was a violent revolt where the peasants went against the nobles and the princes. And first he admonished both sides to have peace. But then in the end, he eventually supported the princes. And that did not help him, because a lot of Luther's support for the Reformation was from the lower class and was from the peasants. And he basically wrote a book there. You see it says, Against the Murderous and Thieving Hordes of Peasants. That's what he wrote. and that did not help him out at all. So that was kind of a dark time on Luther. In 1527, he composed the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and we sing that in church still today. So he composed that hymn. During the time when he began to experience physical illness and bouts of mental depression, that's when he wrote that. Also, his wife, Katie, she was there, and she really brought him through, especially a lot of the mental depression. He did have some pretty dark times in his life, and he's still gonna, it's 20 years before he dies, so he struggled with depression, and she brought him through that. 1529 is the Marburg Colloquy, which the Protestants debated the nature of the Lord's Supper. And so this is where you really start getting a point of disagreement, is that they rejected transubstantiation, but was it consubstantiation? Was it some other kind of a view, like a spiritual view, or was it symbolic? So there was a lot of disagreement between the Protestants. 1531, students recorded Luther's stories and remarks during his meals, and this was published in what is called Table Talk. 1534, he completed the translation of the Bible into German. 1545, he wrote Against the Papacy at Rome, founded by the devil. So again, just really hammering away at the papacy. And we're a good number of years, almost 30 years into the Reformation when he wrote that. So he's, the Reformation is definitely rolling forward and is unstoppable. February 18th, 1546, after several years of poor health, Luther died after experiencing chest pains. Now, I put a note down there. This was not a great blow to the movement, because so many others had joined. Obviously, it's a blow because Martin Luther, who founded it or sparked it, he died. But the Reformation has so much momentum that it was not going to be stopped. And so really the movement didn't suffer in regards to that, because so many others had joined, other reformer big names like Calvin and Zwingli and others. They came up and they were pushing the Reformation ideals. Okay, Luther's theological highlights. Number one, he believed in justification by faith alone, so he got rid of all the works. He believed in righteousness. He believed in alien righteousness, which is the righteousness imputed on the believer when they're saved. So when they call on Jesus to be saved, the righteousness of Christ is imputed onto the person. So when they're a believer, they are righteous in God's sight. That's called alien righteousness. The second one is proper righteousness. And this is righteousness which a man can work after possessing the first kind, after possessing the alien righteousness. After the person is saved, then they can also perform righteous works, which is called proper righteousness. So he believed in that. Number three, sola scriptura. This is the belief that Scripture alone is the final and only infallible source for matters of faith and practice. So we'll get to the solas under John Calvin, but he believed in sola scriptura, so the Scripture alone is the final authority. Number four, baptism. He supported infant baptism as the mark of entering into the Christian community and beginning a life of faith. He said that faith did not have to precede baptism. So he believed in infant baptism. Number five, he rejected transubstantiation and embraced consubstantiation. Now, if you remember, transubstantiation, the elements become the real body and blood of Christ when they're consumed. And so that's the Catholic Church's stance, and he rejected that. What he did was he believed in consubstantiation, where the real body and blood of Jesus exist, but the elements don't change, and they exist alongside the elements. And it's kind of a mystical kind of an idea. But when it's consumed, the bread and wine don't change into flesh and blood. It's still bread and wine, but Christ is with them. And then I put on there the symbolic view, because that comes out of the Reformation, the symbolic view, where the elements are only symbolic of body and blood of Christ, which most, definitely Baptist churches hold the symbolic view. Number 6, he believed in the priesthood of all believers, which I already mentioned earlier. Okay, so that is it for Martin Luther. I'll see you in a second.
Hey class, that's it for today. Next time we will be looking at the reformer Ulrich Zwingli. Have a great day.